One last question before you go, really simple one. Did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election?
He was president for 4 years. Clearly so.
He clearly won the election.
Like, I'm not an election evaluator, but it sure seems to me like he did.
Energy Secretary Chris Wright earning the distinction of being a member of the Trump cabinet who could admit Joe Biden won the 2020 election. A simple fact, by the way, if you want to know just where we are as, not as a country, not even as Washington, D.C., but just where we are as we look at the White House. We find ourselves in a position where you actually have most of the people that are inside the White House afraid to admit a basic fact that any of us could get judicial notice of in any courtroom in America. Why? Because 63 federal judges said it. The Supreme Court said it. Republican and Democratic officials said. And yet here we are with gas prices at $4 plus a gallon, with rent hard for so many working Americans to pay mortgages. For younger Americans, forget about it. And the cost of health care, well, the horrific, beautiful bill gutted health care for so many people in red state and blue state America. So instead of looking forward, you actually have a White House that is looking back to 2020. David Ignatius is going to explain why the President of the United States undercut his own argument and strengthened the argument of those who said what, well, we all know, that Russia tried to influence the 2016 election. And it was Donald Trump who released the documents that proved it yet again. This morning, we have with us the co-host of The Rest is Politics of BBC's Katty Kay, U.S. national editor and columnist at the Financial Times, Ed Luce, columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post, David Ignatius, and opinion columnist for the New York Times, David French. We're going to start with Little Potpourri. There's so much to talk about. Katty, first, we go to the beautiful game. The agony that is England once again, a team that proved even in their game against France they were good enough to win it all if they had only had a manager that knew. Speak as an American, that was the World Cup match for the losers. For the losers. Those that didn't get all the way through. There are no consolation prizes in America,
Was
Katty.
it or
You should
was
know
it
that
not
by
the
now.
most exciting match of the weekend, however, Mr. Scarborough?
Well, it was, and it also proved my point. This is the first English team that I ever saw that wasn't scared of its own shadow. I wouldn't have trusted Harry Kane at the end, but Jude Bellingham, I mean, that guy gave that entire team exactly what it's been lacking through the years. I want to go from sports to movies.
Well, he's the 7th Prime Minister in the last decade, which is, we're getting used to it, but it's really kind of Italian. It's not how British politics used to work. In my first 40 years on this planet, there were 6 British Prime Ministers, a couple of them serving more than a decade, Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher. So he comes with a low life expectancy in the job. But what I'll say for him is that he's a lot more human than Keir Starmer, who, let's be fair, was kind of robotic, not a natural political leader, didn't communicate very well with people. Andy Burnham, who's been mayor of a big city of Greater Manchester for almost a decade, he's just good at retail politics. And, you know, that's not nothing when you're following a robot. So expectations are not high for him. Some members of my profession, not always the fairest, almost Solomonic in their judgment, are already writing him off. I would give him a reasonable chance because he is good at politics, and you know, that would enable him at least a chance to try and develop a theory of the case, which has been lacking in Britain. Right. How do you grow?
Yeah, I mean, how do you grow? And actually being a political athlete matters. Saying it doesn't matter is like saying knowing how to move with the ball at your feet doesn't matter in the beautiful game. It most certainly does, and Keir Starmer just was absolutely miserable at it. Extraordinarily disappointing to so many people who thought he was going to be a good, solid, technocratic leader. There'd be a great contrast to the Conservatives. He simply wasn't. Before we dive straight into the news, David Ignatius, I just have to circle back to you because we bumped in with an official of the Trump administration actually saying that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. I loved your column, your most recent column, where you thanked the president for undercutting his own argument, which is exactly what he did. The telling part of that entire charade was when he released the documents that said two things. Number one, the Russians were trying to influence the campaign to help Donald Trump become elected president of the United States. And number two, that when enemies of America want to disrupt democracy, what they do is they start spreading doubt about the fairness of elections. Again, Donald Trump calling himself out. I'm not saying he's an enemy of democracy. I'm just a humble, as you know, state school, dumb country lawyer. I'm saying in these documents contain intel assessments that if foreign powers want to undermine the United States' confidence in democracy, then what they will do first is they will try to undermine their confidence in fair and free elections, which is, of course, against all evidence what Donald Trump has been doing since 2020.
So, Joe, this was an amazing spectacle, really. For people who didn't watch Thursday night, the president was really, almost shouting. He was making the wildest charges about election fraud and deep state conspiracies. It's the kind of thing that you see online in very intense blogs and sites, but you don't hear that directly very often from the president. But he said, if you want to check this out, go to whitehouse.gov and look at the intelligence documents that I've just declassified. So over the weekend, I took him at his word, and I thought, okay, I'm not doing anything else Saturday other than watching England massacre France, but I did read these documents, and it's extraordinary, Joe, that if you look over them carefully, they rebut almost everything that the president said. A key part of his case was the Chinese tried to defeat me, intentionally went out to defeat me in the 2020 election, which obviously he still can't get over. He can't believe that he lost. So it must have been the Chinese. And you look at the intelligence assessments that were produced, which he's, thank you very much, supplied, and you see that the consensus judgment of the intelligence community was precisely the opposite, that the Chinese did not decide to intervene to defeat Trump. They thought about it, but they decided against it. There were a few analysts who disagreed and thought the Chinese had done more, although not everything they could have. They were given separate space to make the argument. It was kind of a classic snapshot of how our intelligence community actually works. If this is a deep state, man, it moves at the speed of a snail. They go week after week debating sentence by sentence. So it couldn't have been more different from what the president was arguing. And I think it was wonderful, in a weird way, that he invited us all to look at the actual material. When he makes charges so often, we scramble to fact check them. In this case, the president provided the fact checking glossary right there, whitehouse.gov. Thank you very much.
Wouldn't it be nice if millions more Americans had spent their weekend doing what you did, David?
No.
Actually looking at the actual documents.
No, I did it so they didn't have to.
They didn't have to, which is why it's so extraordinary that Chris Wright, the energy secretary, said, it sure seems to me like he did win the 2020 election. Shouldn't be extraordinary, but it is. OK, let's turn to other news now, because there's been a lot, of course, going on in the Middle East, where 3 American service members were killed in action over the past few days, as the United States and Iran inch closer and closer to a return to all-out war. U.S. Central Command announced yesterday the death of an American soldier in northern Iraq who was killed during the disposal of a downed Iranian drone. Two 2 U.S. soldiers were also killed on Friday in Jordan during an Iranian missile barrage, and one is still missing. The latest fatalities raising the death toll of American military personnel in the Iran war to 17, while hundreds of other troops have been injured. The two sides, meanwhile, are continuing to exchange fire. The U.S. announced a new round of strikes overnight for the 9th consecutive night, as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the loss of U.S. soldiers, quote, only stiffens our resolve. Iran says at least 50 people, meanwhile, have been killed and more than 500 injured since the U.S. resumed its bombing campaign. In return, Tehran is once again targeting U.S. bases and other sites across the Gulf, including attacks on a power and water treatment plant in Kuwait. As for what comes next, well, a senior Iranian government official told MS Now that the Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Iran is no longer valid, quote. And a senior foreign diplomat inside Tehran who is linked to the negotiations told MS Now, quote, there is no hope of peace in the near future. Joe, I mean, we knew the MOU was not holding up. I think it's a little surprising the speed with which both sides, or at least the Iranians, have acknowledged this is done, it's over. And the question now, do we bumble along? I mean, oil prices are up, but not massively. We're not over $100 a barrel yet this morning, although we hear that supplies are very low. So where does this take us?
Well, I think we bumble along. We bumble along, David Ignatius, because there's not much of a choice to do anything else. The president tried to get an MOU that Iran would accept. The terms were worse for the United States than Kaiser Wilhelm II had to sign at the end of World War I at Versailles. We were giving $500 billion to the Iranians. We all know the president took sanctions off of Iran and allowed them to sell oil in a way they hadn't since 1979. It didn't change their behavior at all. In fact, things got even worse. So now the president's going back to understanding he's going to have to show strength with the Iranians. But this from the Washington Post, your newspaper this morning, that the president's talking about the possibility of a more expansive war, but they're limited in how far they can expand that war by a limitation on munitions, both long-range munitions and also the sort of weapons that they would need to continue this fight for a long time, and even the possibility of ground troops, which the president refuses to rule out. Even that possibility right now limited by all the damage in Iran. So what is the next move? It's a question we've been asking since the middle of March, and the answer is no more clear. There is no easy answer, is there?
No, there isn't. We've spoken, commenting on this for the last month or so, about a term that's used in chess where every move you make makes your situation worse. And I fear this may be one of those situations. The Washington Post headline this morning says the U.S. teeters on the brink of all-out war with Iran. That's a frightening thought, that we could be drawn so deep into a conflict that President Trump clearly wants to get out of, but knows that he can't get out of now because the Iranians control the Strait of Hormuz, a key waterway. I've written that maybe Trump should just find a way to keep his mouth shut and walk away from this, keep the pressure on Iran, but not continue towards ground invasion or other radical escalation. But Joe, it's one of those situations that reminds you of the very worst moments in history, where a war begins. People think it's going to last a short time. In World War I, the generals thought the troops would be home by Christmas when they went to war in August 1914, and we all know the just nightmarish carnage that followed. I've begun to wonder if this isn't a little bit like what Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda did to the United States. Their strategy was to draw us deeper and deeper. They wanted the war to continue. They wanted us to invade Afghanistan. They wanted to draw us into a field of conflict where over time they would just stretch us out and attrit it. tread us. So that's one fear I have. But I have to say, in this moment, the choices that President Trump faces are pretty much all bad.
Yeah, they are. And David French, let's circle back and go back to the MOU for a second, something that we have to do, because if the United States gave the Iranians those terms, gave them $500 billion, gave them basically de facto control of the strait, allowed them to continue their nuclear program, allowed them to continue unabated their missile program, and again, funded them $500 billion, lifting sanctions off of their oil, which the State Department just a week before that deal had said, this is how the Iranians fund their terror operations. It would have left Iran in a stronger position than it's been in 47 years. They would have left Iran as the dominant power in that region. So I know a lot of people are saying, oh, well, let's just get out of there. Well, yeah, let's get out of there, but with an understanding that the Iranians are at the very most going to be where they were when this war began. And that's going to be a real challenge for the president because, of course, it may require some military troops to keep the strait open.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a situation now where, and I'm glad David raised this, where it seems as if everyone is putting their foot on the gas, nobody is putting their foot on the brake here. And so when that is happening, you see mutual miscalculation after mutual miscalculation. So this war begins with a catastrophic miscalculation by the Trump administration that this could be like Venezuela 2.0. The prospects of that were never good at all. And then when that didn't work out, it was obvious they didn't have another plan. And now, Joe, I'm wondering about the Iranian government here. If there is a miscalculation on their part, they could have wrapped both arms around that memorandum of understanding and emerged from the conflict stronger, in a stronger position than when it began strategically. A clear loss for the U.S. But now, again, they're continuing to close the strait. They're continuing to keep it closed. That's fundamental to any deal to end the war. And now they're taking serious damage along with us, obviously. Again, nobody has a foot on the brake here at all.
And if the Iranians didn't have so many factions fighting each other right now internally, somebody with half a brain would have taken that MOU. And if they'd been able to force everybody else to take that MOU, Iran right now would be stronger than any other country in the region and be set to dominate it for a generation. But they have factional fighting there, as we do here politically. David, thank you so much for being with us. Greatly appreciated. And still out on Morning Joe, we're going to get back into the action from the World Cup final soon and how Spain took down the defending champs. When I kept hearing Henry speak of Spain and just their system built for victory from the ground up, and if you're an 8-year-old, you're playing, you're learning the same tactics that you are when you're 12, when you're 16, when you're 18, whether you're a man or a woman. The system is extraordinary. They believe in the system, and it has led them to extraordinary success across every area of football. And I'm just curious, again, let's ask this question that we asked 16 years ago of each other. What does America need to do to start building from the ground up like that?
I think
because it starts today.
I think have you run the game in the United States? Everything you've said is really, really beautiful and really, really true. Look, football ultimately is an idea. Football makes you feel things. Football makes you feel alive. But that idea, the crucial ages are like 6 to 11. That's where the fundamentals are baked in. And in the United States, it's a wonderful first participatory sport. But the whole system, the whole idea is so incoherent. It's so jerry-rigged. And what you articulated about Spain, they had a series of failures, a series of humiliations, and they invested a huge amount into understanding who they are, what they wanted to be. And every kid, and you nailed it, it's the men and the women. The women are also able to play football like ferocious Ewoks, tossing the ball around as if it was a hacky sack on a basketball court. Those fundamentals are baked into the Spanish idea. Here we have none of that. I think it's a... You know, the true tragedy is we have a commercial heft. We have every major brand wanting to fling money into this sport. The popularity is off the charts, but the popularity is for the European game. We're obsessed with the Premier League, the Champions League, and taking a moment. This World Cup has been so wildly popular. It's been so commercially successful. It was the first sporting event to make more than $13 billion. The eyes on it are remarkable. And what it needs now is calm reflection, a real strategy. The questions you're asking, I can't articulate it any better than you did, Joe. But what do we want to do in America? What is the idea at the heart of our play? And then how do we create a system so that every girl or boy, wherever they are, by the way, it's not a suburban game. It's not a rich person's game. It's not a game where you have to have $50,000 a year to invest in your kid's progress. This is a game where it's won with hunger, with desire, with talent. It's a working class game. And how can we tap into the unparalleled skill sets, the unparalleled resources of every community in America? That's the only way the game is going to soar in the United States, on the field as well as off it.
You know, Pablo, Bobby Knight, obviously one of the greatest basketball coaches ever. He had a guy that would always drive around with him when he was recruiting. I'm sure you've heard this story. If he drove by a house and they didn't have a garage, Bobby jumped out of his car and ran in there. If they had 1-car garage, he was fine. 2-car. But this guy said that anytime Bobby Knight went to a home that had a 3-car garage, he said, keep driving. And he was dead serious. Because he said if they had a 3-car garage, that kid, when the going got tough and was getting screamed at, chances were good, the odds were good, that kid was going to fold under pressure, or he didn't need basketball the way somebody else might need basketball. That's one of our dilemmas when we look at the World Cup. People don't understand. This is a working class game in Europe. There's so many of the kids that are these beautiful superstars, that grow into these beautiful superstars, came from some of the roughest parts of their cities, from their communities. This was their only way out. In America, it started as an upper middle class person's game, and the goal is to get a scholarship to, to Tufts. Or if you're really lucky, Holy Cross.
That's right.
It's just not the same.
A good liberal arts education is the way forward for U.S. soccer, Joe. The classics and understanding of that.
It's the truth. It is the truth. It's the truth, man.
Let's deconstruct as a bit of art history here the photo that was the story of this final, which was Leo Messi, maybe the greatest of all time. Someone who was so small once upon a time, Raj, correct me if I'm wrong, that he needed literal HGH injections to be just sort of on par with his peers, right? That's the story of Leo Messi from Argentina, but needed that in Spain to speak to the country that won this thing, actually. And then in this photograph, which I will describe for you in the theater of the mind in case we don't have it as I filibuster here, you have him bathing Lamine Yamal, who is the best young player in the world, who was on the Spanish team, who was so poor that he's part of a charity program in which he's being bathed.
And you missed out one detail. He was a 6-month-old baby. It wasn't last week.
That's fair. That's a fair point, yes. To get the actuarial charts, I should clarify. He's a literal baby in the photograph in a tub being bathed by Leo Messi in like a UNICEF program. And so that's the sort of socioeconomic demographic that we're describing in just that one photograph.
Wait a minute.
And
wait, the HGH, where was that when I needed it?
This may be the public-private partnership, Mike Lupica, that we need.
No.
Therapeutic use exemptions for our best young athletes who need a way out.
But, Pablo, this whole thing that everybody's talking about right now, Jim Patterson, writing partner, has a line, hungry dogs run faster. And what Joe's talking about this sport around the world, I think it's true. And I just look at this sport and think of all the Saturday mornings I spent with my 4 children on those mean streets up in Connecticut. And I'm wondering, why can't we develop players like these? And I thought, I was one of the people who kidded myself into thinking this was going to be the year. And, I know, you sometimes think it's going to be the year in England. And Roger
I'm
says,
American
"Don't."
now, baby.
He says, "If we ever," Roger says, "If we ever win, if England wins, you've stolen our greatest natural resource, which is misery in sports." But this whole tournament spoke to me. Why can't we be better at this sport?
The nice news is we're very good at women's football. 341 days until the Women's World Cup takes off now, and we will kick ass and we will take names, Joe.
Yeah. So Roger, let's talk about England, because obviously a lot of interest also for a lot of viewers here with England.
Sigh here on set in New York, by the way.
Know, but here's the thing.
Yes.
England has always been a team that choked. England's always been a team that you could tell was going to melt. When it was extraordinarily when the pressure was turned up. This is the first time I saw an English team that I said, okay, they've got what it takes to win, and not because of Harry Kane, because Harry Kane looks like every English superstar that's choked in the past when you just look at his face. Jude Bellingham, too young to know about the past, too good to care about the past. This England team, even though Spain was extraordinary, this is a team that could have gone all the way, except for this collapse into prevent defense, this collapse into a 5-4-1. That talk about the tactical move that I think England fans will be bemoaning for generations to come.
First of all, I just want to acknowledge how beautiful it is that football has come to this extent in America, Joe, that we get to talk about this on your show. Look, England, and I want to be clear to your audience, I am as American as Matthew McConaughey. I cheer for them even when they do play against England, so I'm neutral and objective on this issue. Look, England were remarkable. Jude Bellingham is this gentleman. If you don't know who he is, he's the most English person ever Englished. He has an American mentality. He says, I'm a winner. We win. I have big character energy. English people don't know what to do with him. Many of them didn't even want him in the team. That's toxic, that kind of mentality. English people do not have a very... they don't talk about sex, money or winning. And I think he does at least 2 out of every 3 in every minute of the day. He's a remarkable human being. They will win with that man. But they exhausted themselves at the end of the day. They went into the Azteca in Mexico, which is not a football stadium. It's a Game of Thrones fortress, and they won there. That was probably up there with winning the Battle of Britain, and 1066 is a human achievement in England. Yes. But you know as well as I do, Joe, at the end of the day, England and World Cups, they won in 1966. It is the greatest single day in modern British history, post-empire, post-industrial collapse. And they don't want to win now. It's like Charlie Brown running at a football with Lucy Holding. That familiar misery, that familiar trauma, the agony of being English right now is that they were beating Argentina, and you said it, they went into prevent defence. They will have watched this final where Argentina were terrible, and they would have said, why not us? Why did we do that? We hired a German coach to make us win. He was meant to be ruthless. He was meant to take us at the next level. Instead, they turned him into an Englishman. And they're now just... like, the whole English nation is like Natalie Imbruglia in the corner, cold, naked, lying, shamed on the floor. And that's how they like to be, Joe. I don't mean to be rude, but that's very reassuring for England.
Look, we're even having to get a new Prime Minister this Monday morning just to prove the point that our politics are crap, our football, we can't make it, the weather, well, we've almost become Mediterranean, but without the good things that go with the Mediterranean. I mean, that's kind of how England's feeling this morning, right, Roger? But look, hey, Roger, quick question to you on the Team USA. We had Gary Lineker on at the beginning of the tournament, and I was asking Gary, what would it take to make America love football? Okay, we've got the hydration breaks. That adds a bit more money. Maybe it's as simple as that. Just put in some more advertising time, and then you have an American sport. And he said, I don't know, maybe America just has to give up on this fantasy of wanting to love football. You've got other great sports in this country. Why do you keep chasing the thing you don't have? Maybe it's just never going to come here.
The reality is, America loves football. This is the ridiculousness of all of this. We've watched Kansas City, Arrowhead Stadium rock with nice. Tens of thousands of football fans filling it. We've watched Dallas Stadium. I was there. I met Jerry Jones. He's like, I want to have experiences like this in the NFL. But more than anything, Americans own the sport now. Every more than half the Premier League teams, the biggest teams in Europe, are under American ownership. For good or for bad, it's complicated. I want to be candid. Football, the fan base, the ownership, well, our men's team is disappointing. But football in general is about to enter the American century. And by the way, American sports fandom will have watched this World Cup. There'll be SEC teams doing the Viking row now. Football will be cross-pollinating with American sports, and American sports have cross-pollinated with Europe. One of the legacies of this World Cup is that the biggest athletes in the world in football have seen Dallas Stadium. They've seen SoFi. They're all leaving. I've spoken to them. They're like, we want to play in Europe in stadia like this. So the American influence is going to be incredibly large in the next century of football, and that's probably the greatest legacy, along with the memories we've all made of this World Cup.
Yeah, I think that'll be. I think that will be a great legacy. It really was, I think, a turning point. But U.S. soccer has got to figure out how to organize themselves from the ground up, because right now, again, you have to have rich parents who can afford to send their kids to academies in America. In Europe, they paid families to get their kids, to have them start learning how to play. Welcome back to Morning Joe. Live look at the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, at 6:56 on a Monday morning. Mika would tell you to get up, get ready for work. I will do no such thing. Ed Luce, you recently wrote a column for the Financial Times called Democrats Are Not in Great Shape, in which you analyze the influence of progressive organization, the Democratic Socialists of America. And you write this in part, quote, since late June, when DSA candidates pulled off upset victories in New York and elsewhere, Trump has invoked communism 94 times. The term carries few negative connotations to anyone under 50. Were the DSA simply advocating for public health care and fair taxation of AI oligarchs, Trump would not get much traction. Both are popular with median Americans. But the DSA also comes across as anti-American, which doesn't play well in the heartlands. It's also hard to figure out which they disdain more, Trump or the Democratic Party. In the storied tradition of left sectarianism, the suspicion is that Trump is the lesser of the two evils. At home, they haven't met a border or a police department which they approve. In short, they channel the Berkeley campus, not American suburbs. So I get all of that. I mean, there have been some extraordinarily loony ideas coming from some of these people who've actually won races and are going to be seated in Congress most likely, like, getting rid of prisons, getting rid of cops. That didn't work well for Democrats before. It didn't work well for American cities either when people were talking that way. America's getting safer again, in good part because both parties have come to the conclusion that police officers are a good thing. Police officers make communities safer, make our children safer, make our schools safer. That said, there are extremes, and they are extremes. And I guess my question, Ed, is why the Democratic Party is so ill-equipped to deal with those extremes, brush them off, and instead focus on candidates that are mainstream, who are going to end up winning most of these primaries and who are most likely going to take over the House and Senate.
So, I mean, I think there's a real problem here that the DSA have identified. There is an anti-establishment energy in the Democratic Party that's been channeled a lot through the DSA, which is, this is an aging Democratic establishment that's kind of not got too many ideas. And so it is ripe for disruption. And that's the sort of premise of why the DSA is doing so well. But look, the DSA are winning in very, very heavily blue areas, what I, not me, but others have called the commie corridor, in New York, goes straight through Chelsea, etc. And they're winning with highly educated voters. But their sort of theory of the case is that we're aiming for the working class. And I think Plattner example was a really good one. You have highly educated sort of plutocratic socialists selecting a guy they claim is blue collar. Turns out he isn't blue collar. Turns out he was grown in a vat. And you've got this sort of Berkeley Jacobin magazine approach that is going to boomerang in their faces, I think. The working class, the blue collars we're talking about, the African Americans in South Carolina, none of this really speaks to them. I think, you know, they've seen this movie before. They've seen sort of highly sectarian leftist candidates emerging out of, you know, highly educated places and not doing well with the general electorate. So if you ask your median South Carolina and African American voter, they're not going to coincide with what your median Berkeley campus student says. But the latter seem to be where the energy is.
Yeah. You know, that's the thing, though, Eddie. I mean, you don't have to go back to the 1930s to figure this out. Just go back to the last contested Democratic primary. I remember watching the first Democratic primary debate in 2020. And Mika said at the beginning of the night, because I was an independent, are you going to register to be a Democrat now? This is so exciting. And by the end, there were like 17 people on stage. Most of them were calling for the return of busing. They were talking about health care benefits, universal health care benefits for illegal immigrants when, you know, a good chunk of Americans were having trouble getting health care coverage. And about halfway through the debate, I turned to Mika and I go, nope, not right now. I'm not, because they're crazy. Well, what happened? And I say all that to say Democrats need to take a deep breath and understand where this ends. What happened is this. The people spewing just like the most extreme positions, some of them did pretty well in Iowa. Some of them did pretty well in New Hampshire. Joe Biden, I think he ended up in 4th in Iowa, 5th in New Hampshire. And then when you actually got to South Carolina and got to working class voters, Biden rolled to victory. So, yes, there's a lot of noise right now. And, yes, you know, left-wingers are going to win in left-wing districts. I mean, for Democrats, you hope they do because, you know, it's you know, and moderates are going to win in moderate districts. This reminds me so much of the start of the 2020 campaign where everybody was darting as far left as they could. Joe Biden stayed in the center. Joe Biden won.
Yeah, Joe Biden won. I mean, we've had sort of some differences of emphasis before, Joe, about, you know, how great Biden was as a president and whether he should have run again in 2024. But in 2020, as you say, everybody else was competing to be who could be most far left, and Biden was the one standing. Biden was the sane one. I think we're looking at something like a replay of 2020. But AOC is, I think, smarter than your average sort of Beto O'Rourke type that you were describing was on the stage back in 2020. She didn't endorse Graham Plattner. She's quite a thoughtful, shrewd politician. She's not as easy to typecast as Bernie Sanders. But she's going to start off, I think, with a head start. She's going to have a ton of energy from the left. The question is, how good is she at being practical and thinking practically for the blue-collar voter, who is ultimately the real base of the Democratic Party? Maybe it doesn't make the most noise, but the real base, you know, are not in the faculties. The real base is on the ground in places like South Carolina.
Exactly, and you know, I'm glad you brought up AOC. You look at we always talk about political athletes. AOC, Mamdani, they're great political athletes. It's that simple. That's why they're drawing attention. And you don't see many great political athletes in the center of the Democratic Party. I would say one that's emerging right now is Jon Ossoff. I mean, that's a guy who's starting to get attention and actually could fill up the center like another Georgia politician in 1976, 50 years ago. So Ed's piece is available to read online. Ed Luce of the Financial Times. As always, thank you so much. We're going to sneak in a really quick break here, and still ahead, Retired Rear Admiral John Kirby standing by. We're going to talk about where things stand in the Iran war and developments out of Ukraine when Morning Joe returns. You're looking at Provincetown, Massachusetts, on the tip of the Cape, 709, to the beautiful, beautiful sounds of Whiter Shade of Pale. We're going to just listen to this for an hour. Or maybe not. Kenny Kay, David Ignatius, and Pablo Torre are still with us, along with one of my favorite songs. And joining the conversation, we have former White House official under President Biden, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby. He's an MS Now national security analyst. Admiral Kirby, tragedy, obviously, over the weekend. We lost some U.S. servicemen, and that is just, I know you understand, like I do, in representing a district of 5 military bases. Just what an extraordinary tragedy that is, not only for those around them, but of course for the families who have to suffer. Let's talk first of all about their sacrifice, and secondly, let's talk about where we are in Iran, because there are no glib, easy answers. We can't cut and run. The MOU that gave Iran $500 billion is a non-starter because they proved they couldn't even be bribed. But it's going to be very hard to fight out of this corner. Where are we? What do we do next?
You can't really talk about their sacrifice without talking about where we are in this conflict. And I think we're at an inflection point here. You can see that the Trump administration is accelerating and expanding their strikes, now hitting military infrastructure, railways, bridges, that kind of thing, trying to really put economic pressure on the IRGC and the military there in Iran. The question is that going to be enough to force the Iranians to the table? And you have to remember that the folks that Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner are talking to are not the folks in charge of the drones and the missiles. The IRGC still runs all the military there in Iran. So it's going to be it's an open question whether this additional pressure is going to force them to the table. And if it doesn't, I can assure you that the U.S. military is preparing for even more expanded attacks and a return to what they would consider major combat operations. I don't think the president wants to go there, and I certainly don't think those who may be considered moderates in Iran want to go there. But I don't believe that the IRGC is particularly concerned about that at this point.
John, David, just wanted to jump in and ask you whether you see any exit ramp at this point. The president obviously doesn't want to get into a deeper, all-out war. He's been trying to resist that.
Yeah.
The Iranians are not giving him the opportunity to resolve this. They're not opening the strait. He faces bad choices. You sat with chairmen, with the presidents in the Situation Room. What kind of advice would you offer to a president who clearly feels he's just stuck in a terrible dilemma?
The problem is largely in Tehran. The IRGC and the moderates, if you want to call them, are not communicating and not on the same page. And as you well know, David, the IRGC doesn't have perfect command and control over all their leaders in the field. And so the difficulty for President Trump is he's trying to manipulate this escalation in a way that, again, encourages the Iranians back to the table. You probably noticed, or maybe you haven't, in the press releases that CENTCOM is issuing, they're now putting in the hour at which the strikes are beginning, and they're adding in the hour at which the strikes are ending. That's unheard of. We never did that before. They're doing that as a message sending. I think that's what that's about. That's about trying to encourage the moderates to get the IRGC on board. That's what really needs to happen here, because until that happens, or until the supreme leader actually exerts some leadership over the IRGC and reins them in, I really don't think the president has very good options here for an exit ramp. And I agree with you. He wants out of this. I think you can hear the Secretary Rubio yesterday talking about the door being open. I think they really do want to find a negotiated way out of here. And I applaud them for that. But until the supreme leader can get control over his own system, I just don't know how we get there.
How long does that take, Admiral?
I mean, could happen in a moment if the supreme leader decides to exert that kind of leadership, or he's willing to push back on the IRGC. But I don't see any indication that he can do that. I mean, it could happen relatively quickly, and I think they want it to. You'll notice they're starting to reposition forces now. CENTCOM's already starting to move extra aircraft in. They are getting ready for a return to what they consider major combat operations, and that could take this to a much wider war, escalate it in very dangerous ways in the region, and then finding an off-ramp is going to be near impossible.
Well, what's made it impossible to find that off-ramp right now, it seems to me, Admiral, is the fact that the Iranians knew that Donald Trump was getting pressure from Republicans because an election was coming up. This is what Jimmy Carter dealt with in 1980. The Iranians knew that Carter desperately needed the hostages out so he could defeat Ronald Reagan, and they used that against him throughout most of end of 79 and throughout all of 1980. As long as the Iranians know that Donald Trump has this false deadline of November, which it looks like he's brushed to the side now because, again, the Iranians proved themselves incapable of even being bribed. That's a weakness they're going to exploit. And I'm not suggesting we put ground troops in Iran, but as long as they know that ground troops are off the table, that is also a calculation they will make. So when we talk about getting out of there, the question is, how do we get out of there without the Iranians not at least believing we're willing to take this even further?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think the biggest issue here, Joe, is that both sides appear to be misreading the other. You talk about them waiting Trump out and believing that he is so afraid of the midterms that he'll do anything for a bad deal. I think that's a misread of where his head is. I mean, and you're starting to see that in these escalatory attacks and the fact that the military is positioning itself to return to major combat operations. The Israelis have not been joining in these escalatory attacks. There's a reason for that. They don't want the Israelis in right now. But if we return to major combat operations, that means that all the gloves will come off and the Israelis will get back involved. And I think the Iranians are misreading Trump's his self-interest here and his seriousness with which he's willing to go back to war. I also think the Trump administration is misreading the Iranians, and don't fundamentally understand the split inside the regime itself. It's not a monolith, and the will of the IRGC to continue to fight. The IRGC they don't care about the Iranian people. They don't really care about the economic costs. These guys are zealots, and they'll fight to the end. So both sides are misreading the other, and I think that's what makes this a particularly dangerous moment.
Well, Admiral, I'm listening to you, and I'm trying to just keep all this in front of me. And so if you're talking about self-preservation from a regime, maybe that's happening here in the United States, but the IRGC, as it deals with factions there, what does this indicate about the prospect of the whole nuclear question? Because if they're trying to retain leverage over Donald Trump, what does that say about their incentives to do anything resembling the thing that Donald Trump allegedly has been seeking, which is the end of a nuclear Iran?
Well, make no mistake, the hardliners, the mullahs and the IRGC still want to pursue a nuclear weapons capability. They're a long way from that now, thanks to the attacks last June, those strikes, but I think they still want it. What they have discovered, though, Pablo, is that they already have a weapon of mass disruption, and that's the Strait of Hormuz, and holding up traffic in and out of the Persian Gulf. And they continue to wield that weapon pretty effectively. There were some more strikes just in the last 24 hours. So they are definitely willing to take this to the brink. But I think right now their main focus is on using the leverage of the Persian Gulf and the economic disruption that the disruption of flow there is causing. That doesn't mean that we still need to worry about their nuclear weapons desires, but I think that's really not front of center for them right now.
So, David, let's expand on this, take it a little deeper, and actually go back to conversations you and I had a decade ago and have had anytime we talked about Iran. And again, Iran is not Iraq. You take down Saddam Hussein, you take down the government. You and I, from time to time, when there was unrest or we were negotiating with them, we would talk about the balance of power between the IRGC, the Ayatollah, the parliament, the president. And it is, in their own way, it's a highly dispersed, complicated system of governing, and which is causing right now the negotiators and the President of the United States great frustrations. My question is whether you think now in retrospect the killing of the Ayatollah may have ended up making this process more difficult because he actually had the power to bring some restraint on the Revolutionary Guard.
So, Joe, we've talked about this often over these painful 4 months of war. On February 28th, the day the war began, you had an Iranian regime that was fragmenting. You had an aging, unwell supreme leader in Ayatollah Khamenei. You had people already jockeying for position, knowing that he would not be around much longer. You had the fragmentation at the top that often is a precursor of change. I think I said on this show and have written often enough that this regime was on a one-way street down. You couldn't tell how long it would take, but it was going down. And we unintentionally reanimated that by wiping out this aging leader who was about to go anyway, and then the tier beneath him, including some pragmatists who would have been good negotiating partners. It's a classic demonstration of what every government official, I hope every newspaper columnist knows, which is the law of unanticipated consequences. You just can't know when you begin a conflict what may happen. My feeling now is that we're looking at an Iran that just doesn't know what it wants to do. It is split. This regime, don't forget, it's still really unpopular. Estimates that 80% of Iranians don't really like the regime, I think, are still probably true. But you know, they're battered and they're standing behind their country. We need to wait and let them make up their mind. I think keep the pressure on, keep a tight squeeze, reduce their revenues as much as possible. The idea of a military invasion on the ground strikes me as just a terrible idea, to be honest. I mean, your point, let's have the threat there. Okay, I get that. But that wouldn't be wise. But, you know, in a month, in 6 months, in a year, Iranians will be able to make decisions they're not able to make now. And there's nothing we can do in the meantime that will push them, I think, to do that any quicker.
All right, MS Now National Security Analyst, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby. We thank you so much for being with us. David Ignatius, thank you as well. And still ahead on Morning Joe, The Odyssey had an epic opening this weekend at the box office, hauling in more than $264 million worldwide. Christopher Nolan's biggest opening ever. I sat down with the film's Academy Award-winning director, Christopher Nolan, for a wide-ranging interview on his global cinematic phenomenon. Just extraordinary. That conversation next on Morning Joe.
I told him, I mean, you got to stop these fires from coming in and, you know, poisoning our air. Our air has been poisoned. I have a good relationship with Mark Carney, but, you know, we got to stop the fires up there. If we can help them, we'll help them. But maybe they should pay us some damages or something, or we should do some tariffs. But it was terrible. I mean, you had businesses closing. In particular, Michigan. If you look at Detroit, Michigan area, they had to close everything. They had to close car plants and a lot of other things. So I've never remembered this happening. Over the last 4 or 5 years, you saw it starting to take place. I've never remembered it happening.
I find it a shame, the administration in the U.S. and Congress people writing these letters and blaming us and so on and so forth, right? You don't get on and start threatening and criticizing, because guess what? One day it's going to be your turn. And we're going to be down there without hesitation to support our neighbors, which we should be. But all the rhetoric going on there, and it's not from all Americans. I'll tell you, Americans love Canadians. And we Canadians love Americans. but to make the comments they did through the administration unacceptable.
That was Ontario Premier Doug Ford responding to President Trump, blaming Canada for wildfire smoke that sent air quality across parts of the United States into unhealthy territory. The president's comments come after 4 Republican members of Congress sent a letter saying that Canada has the tools to better manage its forests and warning the U.S. would act to protect Americans if it doesn't. The air was pretty gross here the last few days. Elsewhere, social media influencers Andrew and Tristan Tate both were arrested in Miami over the weekend after British authorities issued new charges against them, including rape and human trafficking. The UK now is seeking their extradition to face prosecution, including for previous charges related to other alleged offences between July of 2010 and August of 2017. The brothers also face ongoing criminal proceedings in Romania, where they've been under investigation since December of 2022. Both Tate brothers, who have dual US and British citizenship, have denied any wrongdoing. And the FDA is reversing its earlier claim that lettuce from Taco Bell supplier Taylor Farms was behind a nationwide Cyclospora outbreak. The agency says the original testing yielded a false positive, and there are now no confirmed product samples testing positive for this parasite. Taylor Farms says the FDA acknowledged the mistake and apologized. The company had voluntarily recalled iceberg lettuce after the initial announcement, and Taco Bell temporarily stopped using the product. The FDA says it is continuing its investigation as more than 1,600 Cyclospora illnesses have been reported in 34 states, according to the CDC. And we'll be right back with Joe's conversation with acclaimed director Christopher Nolan on The Odyssey.